So today I'm going to talk about my journey creating music with digital audio, and I'm going to do a live demo. And of course, I'm hoping that there's going to be some questions. So as you can see, I've been doing this for a very long time. I know it's hard to believe that, I genuinely, was using this U80 console in 1950. No, I'm just kidding. This is staged. Sorry to disappoint you all. That was at the NAMM show maybe about 6 years ago, and I took the opportunity to go with the flow on that. So my journey actually begins not with that kind of console. It actually begins with this. I had purchased a Mac 7200 and a Digi 001 and this Kurzweil synthesizer, and I had been working as an assistant to a composer at a well-being company, and I had learned how to sequence and create digital music that way. And at the time, would use the Kurzweil as the sampler, and then I would have to send the sequenced information from Digital Performer on that computer to the sampler, and then it would come back in through the Digi 001, and I would record it back onto the computer. And it was very taxing and time consuming to produce any content that way. And if I wanted to, add EQ to a recorded guitar, for example, at that time, I'm sure you guys were looking at that, that it would take maybe 3 or 4 minutes just to render an EQ on top of something. And you would test that a couple of seconds to see if you got it right. And then, maybe do a large area of your track and, generate EQ that way. So it took a long time in the digital world. I didn't have the HD system or the equivalent what they had at that time. This was my project studio, and I was very patient. Luckily was able to get some good work after, and I ended up in LA being a studio assistant to this guy named Steve Reed. And I was the guy that every morning would wake up and turn all the knobs and make sure that all the pots were functioning and the console was working. And there were all these smooth jazz artists that came in, and I was a jazz musician. I wasn't known in the studio as a musician, and eventually somehow by hanging out there, the studio owner was going on tour and his guitarist couldn't make the tour. And that's how I got my first gig, because that guy couldn't make the tour. So I toured the States and Mexico in a smooth jazz group. So that's how things kind of began. And then I met like Avril Lavigne. I did a party and I played music for her. All of this stuff happened in the early 2000s. It just kind of just ballooned. Then I met Michael Jackson's brother. I hung out with him for a month. That was fun. And I learned a lot about the psychology of what these kinds of artists have. Of course, some might say that the psychology that's there is eccentric or kind of outside of the box, certainly. But it was really interesting to hear about the music creation process. And most people at that time were still thinking in terms of how to create music on an analog console. It wasn't, we have all this digital stuff and we can fix it with Melodyne or all these plugins. It's like, let's record musicians, record their best performance, and that's the album. I mean, that's really what it should always be, right? So I was around at that time, and being a musician myself, I was able to also contribute content. This is Kitaro. He's a new age artist, and I helped him on a couple of tracks on this album, playing a bunch of instruments. Later, I went to India more as a producer and recorded some really, really notable artists in India. Having an awareness of their music was very helpful, but I would say having an awareness of the technology was also helpful, because in some ways that assisted me in deciding what kind of workflow I would use on the basis of what kind of studio I had. And that has nothing to do with digital music. I mean, if you have, 10 compressors, you can have a different signal flow if you're recording an orchestra versus, just summing everything and just having a compressor at the end. I'm oversimplifying the process, but I'm sure this makes sense. If you have a really, really great studio, you're going to have much better results. But now that everything is digital, I can do things that I would never be able to do, even with a studio with like hundreds of components in it. Right? That's Ajoy Chakrabarti. And so he's like the Frank Sinatra of Indian classical music, very fascinating music culture. And so I had been exposed to Indian music and studied, not to that same extent, but I have an awareness of the rhythm and the ragas and such. My first encounter was early 2000. And since then, I've grown my awareness of that. And this particular project was a fusion project. I've been able to work in this kind of environment as well. This recording was fun to do. That's on an album that I have called Seven Steps to Heaven. That's called an Esraj. It's a bowed sitar. And he's really, Shubayu is really, really good at it. Mind-boggling what's possible with the fine motor skills, because of course with the sitar you're bending and you're also sliding, and then the bowing, adding. I mean, that's a lot to do on an instrument like that, and it's not very forgiving. You know, with the violin, I play cello, so I mean, certainly cello is not forgiving, but because the tension of the string on a cello is slightly different than that. I mean, there's barely any tension on those strings, so if you're a little bit off, it's totally out of tune. You know, like, so it takes a lot more skill, I would say, to play this gracefully. In 2018, I went to Montreal. I'd been in a Cirque show in 2010, but for a brief period of time. And I kept in touch with the company as a music director on call. Some time passed. I mean, it was about 8 years, but I was asked to come to Montreal to work on this project. In early 2019, I flew to China and we created this show called Cirque X, the Land of Fantasy. And so this was a very big project because as you can see, there's two seating wagons here, and Meyer Sound worked with the show. Now, I didn't create the music alone for this show. There was a team of people that created the music. I facilitated by being, I guess, the liaison between the artists. There was a Chinese composer that I worked with, and then there were some other personnel from Montreal as well. So we kind of all worked together, creating a playback system, custom making songs for each scene and such. And then the two seating wagons had different speaker arrangements. And so there was 64 channels of output. And as these seating wagons would move, there was a software that Meyer Sound helped us create to basically move, I guess, like channels dynamically on the basis of where the seating wagon was pointing, because they would act, there was 3 stages. There was a stage here, and then there was a stage on this side, and then a stage on that side. So this wagon would spin all the way around and sometimes wouldn't see the other side of the theater. Does that make sense to everybody? It was the first of its kind. After COVID, Cirque du Soleil kind of left their partnership with this company because it was a joint venture between the city of Hangzhou, Zinshandi, which was a Chinese company, and Cirque du Soleil. The show took 4 years to create. I came in at the last stage. So the first stage was just costumes, this, that, and the other. So the reason why I bring this to your attention is it was the first time that I really had to think about putting sound out through 32 channels and how to really think about what that should sound like, along with, you know, Jacques Boucher, who was the main sound designer. We would, you know, stay up till 2, 3 in the morning. For the first few weeks, it was like 2 or 3 nights a week. And then I would also work during the day with the artists. And at night, we would tune the mixes that we had in Ableton. Like channel 1 was the seat in front of you. So you'd be sitting there and like one of these seats had a speaker in front of it. And then you would have like, that was just the center. And then channel 2 would be the left and channel 3 would be the right. But then you could also have stuff behind you. There were a couple arrays behind. And so the way that, and then there was stuff coming out behind this projection. The speaker arrays had to be timed properly, and kind of you came up with an average for the seating wagon. But as the seating wagon moved position, then that timing would also change as well. And so that had to be calculated. And so we had to like move the seating and then redo the speaker array time. It was, and then somehow they came up with this part. I don't know exactly what they did, but they came up with a formula so that it would time properly, and it worked somewhat. When I say somewhat, there was only one thing that wasn't cool. When the seats were turned not facing each other, if you tried to have a different sound on one end of the theater versus another, of course, it was impossible to have noise cancellation. That was a flaw. I proposed that they would put a curtain in between that would drop down, but it was never thick enough and it never really worked. So they stopped putting different sound on either side of the theater. But anyways, that was a very complex project, and the Chinese government was very kind to allow us to be experimental. So this is, we're doing some staging here. So, you know, these are lighting designers, also automation, and then directors as well. So the computer that I built was a PC. Normally they run these shows on Apples, but for some reason this client wanted a PC. So I ran everything on a PC, and I ran it on SSD drives and Ableton. And we used RME audio interfaces, which were really, really good. And had a redundancy system. So if one computer failed, there's a switch, and then another computer playing the playback at the same time and following all the different cues. So if the first computer failed, I would flip a switch, and then everything would go out to the exact same channels through the Meyer system. But also I would be sending the time code audio to the lighting people as well, because they would require that have the lighting cues, and because the music would always be the first, the most important thing. That's how we had the system set up. So they got the linear time code from me. Yeah, they fail sometimes, because the way that the Cirque shows work on the Mac, it's the IAC driver that does it. So we send MIDI back into the computer itself in order to have scene changes, because basically the show runs on scenes, and Ableton works on scenes. So you can have a scene with a bunch of audio clips, and you can automate that with this feature called Loop MIDI, or Loop BE for a PC. And you basically use MIDI, like a MIDI channel to trigger like a MIDI value, like a CC value to trigger a scene. And it's hard to explain. I would have to actually demonstrate it. So me explaining it to you might not really give you the full picture, but to oversimplify, you're triggering the show with a keyboard. And so this could be scene 1, right? And that's a note. You can make it be a note, but I would rather use CC values, right? And I'd have a different kind of controller. So it'd just be like a touchpad. And either we would like a software that you can use, and you can, have it put out any value that you want, whether it's a note or a CC value. You just have to run it through that software, and that particular pad would become that. So we would do that, but it would simultaneously send those scene changes to more than one computer. And so sometimes they would fail because it didn't either get the scene change, the MIDI didn't work, or somehow Ableton failed and it didn't go to the next scene. So when that happens, I'd have to switch. It's rare, but it can happen. Yeah. So this is, I work all over the world with this laptop that I'm using right now, and I plug into whatever studio I need. So these days, I think of myself as a modular producer. So whatever the project needs, I'll rent, and that way I can, it really depends on a bunch of factors. So that's what I'm going to get into in the presentation: exploring digital audio and music and the creative process. We all know what digital audio is, so I don't need to read this, but creating music with digital audio. Okay, so what are the considerations? Okay, depending on who you are, you might record your audio into a phone, or you might have an instrument and you'll play that melody. So this could be the composer, this could be the client. I will produce things differently based on who is writing the music and how it's being put into the system. So if it's someone that's recording audio and they send it to me and they say, can you turn this into a song? I'll grab that audio. I'll make sure that I can stretch it to some kind of tempo that works. And I'll use whatever DAW, whether it's Pro Tools or Logic, to do so. And then I'll start orchestrating with that audio that they sent me. And then there'll be some back and forth. It's like, did you mean this? Did you mean that? If it's a really, really good client that knows how to sing and can sing to a click track, my job is a lot easier. Just take that, and then I just add a bunch of parts, and they probably can sing in key, so I won't need to do any correction to what they're doing. Again, if it's just an orchestration, I might get like a violin player giving me like a quartet. Okay, so these are the kinds of things, the challenges. Am I using samples? What quality of musicians? Who am I creating this for? How much money do they have? How much time do I have? Will it be difficult to mix? Where will the artists be captured? Will I be there present with them? Will I be producing them? Will I not be producing them? These are the challenges. So we'll talk more about that. Okay, so if I'm using samples, and let's just say it's a client, a pharma company, and they need a turnaround overnight, can I create that genre of music realistically with samples? Will it be tasteful? Will it be impactful? Or do I need to hire a bunch of musicians and then also have them double what I've done on the computer? So those are the kinds of things that I have to think about. This second thing here, energy is really the whole thing. As you all know, you're all audio engineers. So you're sitting there, you know when the energy's right. You know when you've got a good performance. That just comes with great musicians. If you need to reproduce that with a digital audio workstation or with a sequencer, the advantage that I have as a musician is that I can imagine what the bass player would be playing if indeed it's bass that I'm programming. I can imagine playing drums while I'm programming it. All this stuff I can, by means of my experience, I can do that. And that's how I get the realism. Of course, if the budget is unlimited, just like our time is unlimited right now, I've been told, that's the best thing, right? I can hire, a pedal steel player from Nashville that's all he or she does. They just love doing that. And they add so much to the recording. And because I'm not recording everything contemporaneously, I'm doing things, track by track that way because we're not all in one room. The energy gets built that way in a different way than if it were recorded live. Of course, I love recording bands live, but that's a whole other way of doing things, which I also like. Playability. So if I'm going to create something that's sequenced, of course, I'm going to know that that's a viola part and that's within their range. But can the orchestra that I'm hiring, can they play those parts? Can we afford that orchestra? Maybe that orchestra in Eastern Europe can do it. Do they have 5-10 grand to hire that orchestra? Do we just hire a few violinists? Will they be able to pull it off? Those are all considerations as I'm creating the work for the customer. Genres, so many genres. If it were up to me, I love just playing the guitar and singing songs. That's what I've always loved doing. But somehow I became a jazz musician that played eventually circus music. So that's kind of like film score, kind of theatrical music, world music all put together. But there's so many genres out there, and each one of them has their flavor. If you're producing electronic music, some might think, oh, that's just simple sound, but there's a lot going on there. All the side chaining that's occurring. When that bass gets in, the kick drum is basically being affected by that, whatever bass signal is coming through. So it's side chained, the kick drum side chained to the bass. And you have to make sure your attacks and your releases are done in the way stylistically that is done currently in electronic music. But if you're using that kind of technique in another kind of production, you might not be as drastic with it. Whereas with electronic music, sometimes it's part of the style to have that pumping sound. You want to have that. So you have to consider who and what kind of style of music you're producing for. And the technology will be dialed in based on that. Okay, so whatever style of music I need to produce, I'm always looking at, what's the age demographic, location, and the level of education, and that's music education. Will a complex melody be appreciated and understood, or do I need to keep it simple? That's all considered when a production is done. Most musicians are able to hear many different parts contemporaneously. Most audience members probably can't concentrate on more than one or two things at a time. And so you have to make sure that whatever content you're creating is suitable for the audience that's listening. So if you have 3-part counterpoint or whatever it is that you have, it's going to be lost in translation. And of course, how much money they have. I could spend weeks on a piece of music, months, years. So that's going to determine how I'm going to make it. Track count is important, like how many musicians or tracks there's going to be. If it's just a mix project and someone, or like a production project of someone's work, their band, and they're not really up to par yet and they need to be elevated somewhat, how much of the work can I salvage? How long will that take? How bad is the vocal? And then of course, if the work is 3 minutes or 10 minutes, that's just, that's all obvious stuff. Mixing, this is where I'm sure everyone can chime in. Outboard gear, that really has a lot to do with the style of music. A lot of people are mixing inside the box. I like having assistants on projects because I like to have a second set of ears telling me, hey, what about if, or I love that. I think it's great to have more than one person mixing. Analog or digital only, this again has to do with what I like or what the client wants. And again, that could also be budget as well. But these days, the beauty of digital is that I can recall a lot of presets that I've already made very quickly. Mastering, I like to send mastering out, usually, depending on who it is and what the project is. And when I say I like to send it out, that's for like label-like customers. I do mastering, but if it's that kind of project, I like to get, again, a second set of ears just to be the mastering person. I find that just adds benefit to the project. I think it sounds great to have many ears on the project. But again, sometimes I get asked to do everything. And I think in the current realm of production, production. If you look at the Gen Zs, they just put everything up, including the mastering chain, right in the session. They don't even wait to get the stuff done. They do it while they're creating it. I don't agree with that, but that's what the mindset is now. Artificial intelligence. Okay, so Google has their project, Music LM. I don't know if any of you have listened to it. It's not great. It doesn't really make me think that, musicians and engineers are going to not be useful in the next few years. I think that's completely false. It just doesn't sound that good. Stemmer is apparently an automated system that mixes things. Music LM basically is combing through a whole bunch of different music styles that are classified by the artist names, their repertoire, and then it's analyzing them harmonically through various algorithms that I don't think I would be able to understand deeply, but I understand what they do, but I don't know what the code is doing. But they're somehow understanding, the key signatures, the melodies, and the instrumentation just by actually running it through their process. And then by doing that with verbal prompts, you're able to say, I would like a song that sounds like Etta James and Bootsy Collins. And I want that to be down tempo with a subtle bit of electronic dance music beats in it. And it will do that for you. So here, this is the prompt. A fusion of reggaeton electronic dance music with a spacey, otherworldly sound induces the experience of being lost in space, and the music would be designed to evoke a sense of wonder and awe while being danceable. Here we go. These are examples. They haven't released this capability to the public completely yet. These are examples that I guess were ones that were successful, and they want to show that it's possible. And so Strophe is Stemmer mixes stems. Strophe is a AI music generator, but I don't think it's that great. And Jukebox is another project OpenAI is working on. This is also Google. This is OpenAI.
So there's some big money in this.
Yeah, I think that there is. I just don't think that the results are compelling enough for me to think that it's really great music, but I think that they're getting there. But then again, what makes really great music? I think that there's a je ne sais quoi element that's missing. I think that, all of us have been in front of a great artist and heard them play. And, it's just like that came from somewhere that's just otherworldly. And I just don't get that from that AI music yet. So I'm going to move on to just talking a little bit about my process here. Let's see if hopefully the audio will work.
Yeah, it's coming through.
A little short piece, and a lot of VSTs are being used here. I do have some live instruments, a clarinet, this violin, but I had the violinist play parts twice. overlaid over a bunch of VSTs. So I use the Vienna Symphonic Library, and then the Contact I use Albion. Oh yeah, these are the Hans Zimmer percussions. Yeah, and some of the reverbs are baked in. They sound good. They're pretty good. There's some newer stuff that I have now. I sometimes layer reverbs. I don't just use just one reverb. I used to do this. I don't do it so often anymore, but I used to use a little bit of a plate reverb, and then I would use like an impulse response reverb as well. And somehow I liked the way that sounded together, but I haven't been doing that lately. It just really depends on what my mood is. Vienna has this thing called Mir, which reproduces the sound of a hall. I can load it up. So if I want to create the sense of a room, I use this send here. I have just one reverb, and this is an impulse response. It's an ambient church, right? But sometimes on an instrument itself, I'll also have like a reverb, or might have multiple reverbs happening. It just really depends, because sometimes some of the libraries are recorded very dry. And if I do that, it kind of creates almost like a sense of reflections in that room. Some of the greatest halls in the world aren't perfect sounding. I mean, I'm sure you've experienced that. They have character. So I'm kind of creating my own version of what I think character could be. Depending on what the range of the instrument is, you know, I might even change the pre-delay of the reverb itself so that there's a delay, but then somehow the dry signal with that delayed reverb creates like a harmonic, but I'd have to really dial that in. But that's not for this style of music. That would be something else. Like a guitar player sometimes has like a bunch of different things in their signal chain. If they're adding that reverb, and then let's just say they send it to another gain stage and then they compress it, you're getting that reverb compressed, and then you want to actually make that sound like it's larger than life, you would add another reverb. So it's almost like creating like a chamber, like, you know, like the body of a cello kind of within itself. So you're kind of creating the body with that smaller reverb. So this is another way of doing it. I'm going to select a venue here. And so this is where the microphones are right now. And this is the sound source right here. Musician's output is facing in this direction. And now we're going to add another musician. So I'm going to add another instance of Vienna Pro, and I'll enable that. And now you can see there's another musician here, and I can put him or her here. And you know what? I think that this microphone should actually be right here. It somewhat works, but I'd have to spend some time preparing this for you. So I'm just going to solo these 3 tracks. And I'll just loop that area. So I'm just going to solo this guy. I could remix this and have fun recreating this. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Okay. One second. Yeah.
So with infinite subtle choices possible, how do you decide when you're done?
That's a great question. I have to know what style of music I'm working with. Am I trying to recreate an environment that exists in the real world, or am I trying to create an otherworldly sound? That's one factor that determines whether or not I'm done with something. If I'm feeling like overall I have a good balanced sound, I've created some kind of a feeling in the music, let's say filtering the frequencies that I feel need to be filtered, and then I have that feeling like it's complete when I feel like I just feel at rest or at peace with it. If I'm mixing a genre that has already been done, I might, do that sort of thing where it's like I'm going to A/B between my piece and something else that's out there and then add my own flair. But most of it's going to be, is it up to spec? I'll do something where it gets to a place where I'm happy with it at that moment, and then I'll go for a walk, and then I'll come back and make sure that that's exactly what I was perceiving. I need to be as objective as possible. Of course, there's also who are you mixing this for? I mean, what will the customer appreciate what you've done? Will they get it too? With audio, I mean, it can clearly sound bad too. Like if I put way too much reverb on it, you're not getting the desired effect. Now, if I add another reverb to this, clearly this is just in bad taste. Could be a special effect,
Right.
So if that's what I wanted to do, then I would go, okay, well, that's where I'm going with this. Okay, so now let's go ahead and add, it's a little much, but I would maybe turn the depth down a lot. Yeah, sorry, it's distorting, right? So you see, this is the problem, right? There's probably another plugin that I could use that would be better, or I would just have to sit there and dial in or, bring the gain down on, yeah, definitely.
What kinds of questions do you ask a client to try to predict what they're going to like?
I ask them to give me a music playlist. And then I ask them, what do you want this to sound like? And then I say, how big do you want this to be? Do you want like a 4-piece band? Do you want like a 10-piece band? Do you want this to be like a genre that is recognizable? Or do you want this just to be art? For me, I always want it to be art. I mean, what else are we doing? Even when we're mixing, it's art, like that's art. We're in the process. We're co-creating with it. But sometimes some of the people that you get as a client, they're just thinking, oh, I have this event and needs to be like this. And bottom line is this. And, you go with it and you give them the best. I always give them my best. I always want it to be art.